instead of the domestic American economies it's meant to support, it's illogical. In order to allow current trade to prosper without corporate interference, we negate the resolution. The United States should establish a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement with the European Union. Our sole contention is reversing progress. Absent a trade agreement, the US and Europe currently have one of the strongest economic relationships in the world. As Eurostat 15 finds that both countries are their #1 trading partners and have the largest bilateral trade relationship globally. Such trade is only growing, as Hog24 confirms that exports and imports between the US and Europe increased 27% this year due to both countries entering a trade war with China. The result has been economic prosperity. As Delmore24 writes, the US economy is fast growing, has a strong labor market, and is seeing deflation. Unfortunately, a bilateral trade agreement, or BTA, with the European Union would plummet the US economy as it would deregulate trade, allowing multinational corporations to take over. Gao18 confirms that an agreement would simply reflect multinational corporate interests, as the agreement gives large companies the right to sue the government when it passes legislation that goes against their interests. Even worse, Lester23 finds that trade agreements allow corporations to lobby for rules and special regulations to push their own policies. Indeed, CEO14 finds a trade agreement would reflect corporate interests, as negotiators consult with corporations nearly 20 times more with the corporations than workers and the public. When massive corporations are given such advantages, Gao18 concludes that an agreement would come at the expense of the workers and domestic economy. Therefore, by empowering corporate interests over the people, an agreement would ruin progress in 2 key ways. First is by destroying domestic industries. Given the inherent privileges that agreements give to large corporations, the domestic economy would suffer. As the CEPR14 writes, that post-agreement, foreign firms would have more rights than local firms, putting the domestic economy at risk. Because of such conditions, the WOW16 finds an agreement would create an unfair environment where small companies are forced out of business, leading to 325,000 jobs to be lost. Explicitly, European corporations have stated their desire to displace American jobs. The Public Citizen 17 confirms that documents related to trade negotiations revealed that the EU called for the US government to stop passing policies that supported domestic jobs, targeting 13 states and 23 cities. Thus, because trade agreements effectively force the government to prioritize the interest of foreign corporations over their own people, Scott 13 notes that nearly every trade agreement the US has signed in recent years has backfired, resulting in the loss of over 3 million jobs. Second is by removing financial protections. In an effort to support corporate interests, an agreement would also remove crucial financial regulations. The WOW states, with tariffs already low, an agreement would be forced to remove trade regulations to displace significant cooperation. However, these regulations act as barriers to corporate profits, including banking safeguards that were created to prevent the repeat of the 2008 financial crisis. For example, HAR14 finds actions such as taxing banks, banning speculations, and imposing rules on lending money could all be targeted by an agreement. Given the lack of regulation, SOMO13 reports that an agreement will make it so the US is no longer able to regulate financial services, creating the exact conditions for a financial crisis to take place. Empirically, Amadio22 finds the 2008 financial crisis was caused by deregulation, which Shearholtso9 quantifies pushed over 2.6 million people into poverty. Thus, to allow current trade to prosper without corporate involvement and to prevent a crisis that will lead to the suffering of millions, we are proud to negate.
Historically, the goal of trade deals has been economic, reducing trade barriers such as tariffs or taxes on imported goods. However, because tariffs between the US and EU are already some of the lowest in the world, at just 3% on average, this resolution is not an economic question, but a geopolitical one. Yet when it comes to geopolitics, the limited tariffs we maintain are driving apart the world's most important alliance. Andrew Durham of Politico explains this year that because of the US's few but large tariffs against the EU, officials across Europe are increasingly questioning whether the bloc can rely on the US. Thus, we affirm, resolved, the United States should establish a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement with the European Union. Our sole contention is safeguarding our future. China is seizing this opportunity to expand economic influence over Europe. Dr. Scobell of the U.S. Institute of Peace reported last month that Chinese President Xi Jinping recently made extensive trips to Europe, meeting multiple heads of state with the ultimate goal of weakening EU ties to the U.S. The end result: France, Serbia, Hungary, and many other European countries have accepted billions of investment from the Chinese government. A bilateral trade agreement would strengthen our efforts to limit China in two key ways, and the first is by reaffirming our commitment to Europe. Historically, during the Cold War, Sam Fleming of the Financial Times explains in 2023 that our alliance was at its weakest when U.S. economic policy pushed our allies away, and that only by collaborating economically, that countered the Soviet Union. He continues today that in the face of U.S. tariffs, European governments have become reluctant to participate in our efforts to unite like-minded nations against China. In the face of an uncertain U.S. relationship, David Spellman explains this month that European nations are increasingly likely to enter agreements with China rather than stand up to their coercion. Thus, the U.S. recommitting to Europe is crucial to counter China's influence. The Center for Strategic and International Studies concludes in 2023 that a trade deal would reaffirm our partnership with Europe and show them that they need not turn to China economically, limiting China's authoritarian influence. Second, by building independent supply chains. China continues to build and weaponize trade dependence. Yusuf Khan of the Wall Street Journal confirms last year that China dominates the semiconductor supply chain, controlling 60% of mineral sourcing and 91% of all refinement. These minerals, essential to nearly every piece of technology, give China immense leverage. Despite this growing threat, Catherine Walla of the Atlantic Council writes in 2022 that the US and EU have taken no joint action to address China's monopoly. The reason comes from Bloomberg in 2023, which reports that the US's refusal to remove punitive trade measures like steel tariffs against the EU is the central reason behind Europe's refusal to coordinate strategy with the US. A free trade agreement would definitionally resolve these tensions by removing trade barriers on the EU. Malmstrom of the Peterson Institute for International Economics explains that a deal between the EU and the US would ease tensions and increase cooperation. Overall, the White House reports earlier this year that increasing coordination is critical for creating supply chains free from Chinese coercion, helping coordinate investment into domestic manufacturing, and synchronizing tariff on Chinese products. Ultimately, limiting China's authoritarianism is crucial. China has forced countries like Hungary and France to adopt policies favoring China, leveraged 54 countries to applaud its human rights abuses as counter-terror efforts, and has now turned its sights toward the rest of Europe. If we do not act, Dr. Hal Brands of Johns Hopkins explains in 2020 that the result will be a world where authoritarianism can flourish and where human rights can be violated without consequence. That world threatens the lives of millions, as Sebastian Farquhar of Oxford quantifies in 2017 that during the 20th century, authoritarian states killed more than 100 million people. Thus, we are proud to affirm.
Can we get all of the case evidence?
Just all of it?
Yeah, it's just
Yeah. Do we want to just like both do that? Like
Yeah,
some general
yeah,
cases? I think
sure.
that might be easiest.
I'll put in the doc sheet.
Sounds good.
Alright. Ours is in.
It's a doctor, so. Yeah.
And then I'm good to go for cross and
Yeah, do we want to just start crossovers and?
That's fine.
I need to take a little bit before.
Oh, okay.
Take a little bit of properly anyway. That's 4 seconds.
And
And I'm sending that.
Alright. Good for cross?
Yeah.
Alright. Can I take first question?
Yeah.
Okay. Considering that trade is overall increasing between the United States and the EU right now because they're doing things like a trade war on China, why are commitments low if we're seeing an increase right now?
Yeah, I'd say that trade is not necessarily equivalent to cooperation. For example, our largest trade partner is China, and I wouldn't necessarily say we cooperate with China.
Right, but if we're placing things like more tariffs on China, and is the reason that we cite as to why the United States and EU are coming closer together, then doesn't that signal that they're already moving towards the cooperation you talk about?
No, because the US is also still placing tariffs on the EU, and that is the reason why the EU is moving away from the US, as our evidence indicates.
Sure, you can take a question.
Yeah, so could you just clarify why, what is the specific reason for why this deal would lose jobs and why the U.S. would be forced to prioritize foreign?
Yeah, so what our evidence indicates is that when you do things like pass a bilateral trade agreement, you give big corporations the incentive to lobby the government to push their own interests. Our evidence finds that trade negotiators talk 20 times more with corporations than workers and the public, and is the exact reason why empirically we've seen past trade agreements result in the loss of 3 million jobs.
Yeah, my question is more specifically, why does that happen?
Because they want to benefit their own corporations.
No.
It's pretty clear that, yeah.
Could I just clarify? My question is, why does this loss in job happen? I know your evidence says that but
sure.
I want, could you give me an explanation?
So if big corporations do things like enter the American domestic economy and compete with these small businesses, overall, because they're bigger and more competitive, because they have more economic resources, they outcompete US small businesses, which is why these small businesses at home do things like lose jobs, which is empirically what we see.
So it's large EU firms entering the small businesses in the US.
Yep. In these Okay. So considering we already have things like security councils inside of the United Nations as well as NATO, why aren't these security organizations enough to do things like counter China's influence?
Because China is a part of them. China's on the Security Council.
China's on NATO?
We're on the Security Council and the UN. We're not able to take international joint action given the fact that China is on the Security Council. And with NATO is not set up as an alliance to counter China. It was more specifically to counter
NATO
Russia.
was created to do things like counter communism in World War II.
To counter the Soviet Union.
Yeah, but broadly right now, they're focused on big powers like Russia and China. If NATO exists, why can't they just counter China when they're they increase?
I don't think NATO is at all focused on China. NATO as an organization was created to counter the Soviet Union, and today it mostly exists to unite Europe and the US against Russia. That's mainly its purpose.
Okay, sure. You can take a question.
So, could you just explain on your first argument how corporations are able to sue governments?
Yeah, so what our evidence finds, or broadly what our argument is as well, if you pass a bilateral trade agreement, there's specific provisions inside of those agreements that say things like, hey, we want to do things like increase trade. Our argument is that if you have things like antitrust legislation to prevent the United States from losing their domestic industries, big corporations sue.
That's not my question is, how can corporations sue governments? Specifically, what is that? Because you read that.
Things like file, it's cross, but really quickly, they do things like file cases against US government courts and have the case and eventually win.
Okay.
Okay. Pause 1 second.
So I'm the second speaker for the con on 1179. And the order of my speech is going to be going down their case. Everyone's ready? Alright. Time begins now. When historically our evidence finds that nearly every trade agreement the US has signed in the past has backfired and led to the loss of over 3 million jobs, it's very clear that historically you cannot trust free trade agreements when all they do is benefit the big multinational EU firms while leaving the US businesses to collapse and hurting our domestic economy. But let's go to my opponent's specific arguments. At the top, they tell you that limited tariffs are currently driving apart our alliances. But the first thing to note here is that tariffs are extremely low, as they themselves tell you, which is why trade is so high. What that means is that we've empirically seen a 27% increase in trade just this year, proving to you that our reaffirmment with the EU already exists. Secondly, these low tariffs are still beneficial for the US. Scott 22 highlights that tariffs since 2020 have protected domestic industries from foreign competition and that any removal of tariffs will result in job loss. So while tariffs are low, these low tariffs are still necessary to keep our domestic economy and keep the businesses here. Additionally, to remove tariffs, FTAs impose non-tariff barriers that are much more harmful. Rise 20 explains that to eliminate tariffs, costs and obstacles such as standards and regulations are imposed. These non-tariff barriers in FTA cost the economy 1.9% of its GDP for a decade. We would argue that keeping a strong US economy is key to preventing Chinese influence, as they say, so you're always going to look at protecting the US economy and looking at our case first. But go to their first subpoint on reaffirming commitment to Europe. The first thing to note here is that ties between the US and the EU are strengthening now. Because not only is trade up, but USDS 23 writes that the US and EU already reaffirmed strong mutual commitment to the partnership and defending the rule of law. Secondly, security councils and alliances already exist right now to counter Chinese influence and reaffirm our commitment to the euro. For example, trade agreements and security agreements like NATO exist right now. Thirdly, the EU is already moving away from China, as our more recent evidence from Lao 24 confirms that Europe is now moving to a tough approach on Beijing, showing the deterioration of their relationship. Go to their second subpoint on semiconductors. They try to tell you that the EU is reliant on China's semiconductors right now. The first thing to know is that not many European countries are even reliant on China. Demarius 23 finds that excessive reliance on China is mainly a German problem, not a European one. Most Eastern European countries dislike China and have not been using China as a market because Beijing supported Russia and Ukraine. So while they might cherry pick specific examples, overall the European Union is not leaning towards China. Additionally, the US and the EU are already increasing their semiconductor chip independence, meaning the problem that they talk about is being solved in the status quo. Benson 24 reports that in the US, the Chips and Science Act had led to $166 billion in investments for American chip manufacturing. And Benson continues that in the EU, the European Chips Act put $47 billion into doubling the EU semiconductor market share by 2030. That's why DW23 writes that the Taiwanese chip maker TMC invested in a $3.8 billion factory in Germany and a $40 billion factory in Arizona. Essentially, in terms of collective action, we're seeing the EU and the US right now cooperate on semiconductors. A free trade agreement is clearly not necessary. Now, the last thing to note here is that China does not have the upper hand on the EU because they're also dependent on EU goods. My opponents failed to mention this. Cha23 confirms that China is nearly 100% dependent on European countries for goods like silver, and the EU is willing to cut off these key supplies if China attempts economic coercion. They try to paint this really biased narrative, but in reality, the status quo is working, Europe is fine, the US economy is growing, and there's no reason to vote for them. But go to their impact on authoritarianism, because empirically this has been disproven. Montgomery 12 finds that after analyzing 50 years of data, trade agreements create distrust and exclude countries, exacerbating conflict. When you sign a bilateral trade agreement, you then exclude China, and what that does is cause more fear and more threat towards China, because while China may not be doing anything right now, we are instigating them in the future. Additionally, trade agreements would just cut off regional trade and hurt developing countries. As Capaldo 14 confirms that even if trade did increase between Europe and the US, it would trade off from other regions. No matter what, there's no problems in this quo. You should feel very comfortable voting con.
Is anyone not ready? Okay. It's going to be addressing the rebuttal you just heard, addressing their arguments. Time will begin on my first word. And I'm Ben, speaking for 1055. For the sake of time, we're focusing on our first argument about reaffirming commitment. They make a few responses. First, they say that trade is at an all-time high, but remember what William tells you in Crossfire, which is that trade is not an indicator of political cooperation. We trade just as much with China, but we clearly don't have a good relationship with them. The US-EU relationship is still defined by incredibly high tariffs in certain sectors, which send the signal to Europe that we are not cooperating with them, and we see them as a threat to our own security, harming the relationship. Secondly, they say that tariffs help create jobs. This is one of their arguments. I'll address it when responding there. Third, they say that this deal would create non-tariff barriers that harm the US economy. What non-tariff barriers? What are these barriers? What do they do? None of this is explained. This is just an assertion by my opponents. You shouldn't be buying it. Fourth, they say there are other organizations like NATO which can counter China. But our argument is that if the US and EU are misaligned politically and do not want to work together, that extends to NATO as well. Other alliances are also harmed by the economic tensions and political tensions between the US and the EU. Fifth, they say that China or the EU is taking a tougher approach on China, but we would say that this is all talk and no bite. Specifically, our Spellman evidence says that even if the EU wants to take a tougher approach on China, they are too scared of Chinese retaliation, which is why they need further support from the United States. They cannot act to move away from China if they do not feel supported by their largest ally. Next, they say that trade deals would create distrust and antagonize China, but what they have fundamentally missed is that China is the antagonizer in this situation. They are already being aggressive. They are selling surveillance technologies to European countries, pumping billions of dollars of investment into them to increase authoritarian influence. The problem already exists, and we cannot sit on our hands and do nothing about it. Finally, they say this would harm the developing world, but Gill and Lurch explained in 2014 that in an analysis of all studies looking at the impact on the developing world, it would have likely no harmful effect because the US and EU compete in largely different sectors than what the developing world does, and we cannot displace their trade. With that in mind, let's address their arguments. They like to say that businesses are the biggest beneficiaries of this deal. But what Baker of the Institute for Public Policy explains in 2023 is that corporations are largely against free trade because it allows them to have domestic monopolies and not have to compete with foreign firms, which keeps prices sky high. So they have this fundamentally backwards. Next, they say this trade deal would give power for corporations to sue governments. They are referring to what is known as investor-state dispute settlement, which Sundaram of Columbia University explains in 2023 would be in no future trade deals. The EU has completely moved away from the system. They have no support for it. They are pulling out of other deals that have these same provisions. And Biden said that he would not support including this in any future trade deal. It is incredibly unlikely. Now, let's address the two specific arguments they have given you. The first is about domestic industry. First, ask yourself, what does this trade deal actually do to allow foreign monopolies to displace domestic industry? They don't give you an actual answer in Crossfire. They just say that corporations have power, but don't explain the argument. Fundamentally, they are likely referring to tariffs because high tariffs prevent foreign businesses from entering domestic markets. But remember, we all agree that most tariffs are already at global lows, around 2%. So if foreign monopolies wanted to displace domestic businesses, they could already be doing so without a trade deal. Additionally, they say that free trade agreements largely destroy jobs. The issue is one, that's because our free trade agreements were with countries we already had very high tariffs with to begin with. But additionally, Patniak of Brookings explains in 2022 that their analysis is fundamentally wrong. Although tariffs might protect some jobs in these sectors they are applied to, they increase costs and kill far more jobs in every other industry of the US economy, which is why there is a consensus among all economists that trade is good for jobs. Finally, on financial regulations, Brugge of the University of Manchester explained in 2013 that there would likely be no harmonization over things like financial regulations. Both sides fundamentally disagree on this, which is why for 7 years that we tried to do this, there was no harmonization on financial regulations. It's not going to happen.
Are you ready for Crossfire?
Yes. You can take the first question.
One second, let me come up. Start time now. All right, so out of your last speech, you have conceded that the US and the EU are currently collaborating on semiconductors. If that is true, doesn't that prove that there's cooperation between the two countries right now in more than just trade?
Two things. First, they are individually both investing into semiconductors. They do not have joint programs, for example, on subsidies.
Ours specifically says that they're cooperating on semiconductors. You can read the evidence.
Yes, they are investing in semiconductors, but their political cooperation, the actual ties between the US and EU are incredibly weak. We have massive tariffs in certain sectors on the European Union, which is why our Durham evidence says they fundamentally distrust us.
You just told me in your speech like 2 minutes ago that tariffs are at an all-time low with the EU.
Yes.
So which is it?
Our argument is that there are specific industries like steel that are the key sticking points in the US-EU relationship. The refusal for the US to remove those barriers has shown the EU that we see them as a threat rather than an ally, which is why they're actively moving away from
although
us.
tariffs are the lowest globally, as you yourself said, EU still views this as a threat.
I can keep saying my argument over and over. Overall, most barriers are low, but the specific industries like steel that have high tariffs have massively harmed Europe, and the US's refusal to move away from those tariffs is showing Europe we are not a reliable partner.
Our evidence finds that the commitment has already been reaffirmed. That's why both economies are growing, but you can take the question.
Your evidence just says the US and EU, quote unquote, reaffirmed commitment. That is a statement. That's not an argument. It doesn't say how they're reaffirming commitment and what capacity they did that.
We give you a bunch of examples, but we spent half across on this.
Sure.
You can take the question.
Again, I want a clear answer here on the idea of domestic industries. What does a trade deal fundamentally change that allows foreign corporations to displace domestic companies?
So what we tell you is that when you sign a free trade agreement, you then give, so specifically on our argument of lobbying, which you conceded, we say that when you sign a free trade agreement, the people and the negotiators who create this deal meet with the big multinational companies 20 times more than they meet with the public. That was conceded as well. When that happens, we see that these big multinationals now can lobby for whatever regulations that they want, which benefit them and hurts the domestic economy and small business.
That doesn't answer my question. I understand that lobbying plays an aspect in trade relations and negotiations. What specific policies will come about as a result of a US-EU free trade agreement that would kill domestic industry? I just need a straight answer on that.
We give you specific financial regulations that we listed, for example, lending practices, banking practices. That's the HER 14 evidence from case.
That's just about banks. I'm talking about domestic industries. What would this trade deal do? I want an answer.
Our banks are domestic, first of all, and secondly, like our regulations, all we're saying is that regulations that currently exist, like Buy American policies, would go away.
When was Buy American mentioned anywhere in your case?
That's in our case. You can look at the evidence. It's
Well, you
in
don't
the
say
car-
the words Buy
Right,
American.
but we say specific policies. You ask for specific policy, I'm giving you the
Okay,
evidence of the
So the
clause.
argument is about Buy American provisions, which
And
was
other
not
provisions.
mentioned in your case.
Right, so our evidence says specific policies. If you wanted specific policies, you could have asked us, and I would tell you Buy American, other evidence that's in our cards.
Cool.
We'll take running prep starting now. That was 110.
So
Have
a minute 49.
Yep. All right. Order of my speech, defending our arguments, moving on to this. Everybody good? All right. When you have unequal players and unequal standards, you get unequal results. Our argument is that if you sign a bilateral trade agreement, you give big foreign EU multinational corporations the incentive to do things like lobby against US governments to pass their own corporate interests, which is exactly why empirically we've seen recent trade agreements backfire and cause 3 million jobs to be lost. The first thing that they say is that corporations are against free trade agreements. Their evidence is extremely broad, but ours is specific. It finds that EU corporations are already eyeing domestic jobs in 13 states and 23 cities, showing precedents for the lobbying in the future. The second thing that they say is that things like suing the government won't occur because Biden doesn't want it. Maybe suing won't happen, but they have conceded the Lester 23 evidence that focuses on lobbying and finds that corporations can lobby the government as well, which is why they always get their interest in the first place. On our argument about destroying domestic industries, they say that we don't give them a clear answer as to why corporations take over. Our narrative is extremely clear. The tariffs right now are low, but sufficient enough to protect domestic industries, which is why our evidence finds that big corporations don't have an incentive to take over. Empirically, you've seen that negotiators talk 20 times more with corporations than the public, which is why, again, empirically, you've seen 3 million jobs be lost. They say that affirming the resolution would benefit the US economy. Our Con 15 evidence finds, and it does a meta-analysis of overall economic studies and finds that benefits of a bilateral trade agreement are exaggerated by almost 80%, and empirically, you've seen trade agreements backfire, so if you don't buy our word, you can buy history's instead. But by far, the easiest place to sign your ballot is our second argument about financial deregulation. He spends 5 seconds on it in his last speech and completely misunderstands the argument. It's not about harmonizing regulations. We are saying that with tariffs already low, the only way to create effective cooperation and make a bilateral trade agreement effective is by deregulating the financial sector. Our evidence finds that during the talks of the TTIP, you saw the same deregulation before the agreement was failed. At the end of the day, there's precedence for this argument and they haven't responded to it, so you can vote there really, really easily. But let's go to their arguments. The first thing that they have conceded is that the EU and United States are moving towards a trade war right now, which is exactly why trade has increased by 27% last year. Sure, maybe trade is not a good geopolitical indicator, but the idea that both countries are entering a trade war signals the idea that they're reaffirming commitments. They say that political things are misaligned, but they have conceded that both countries are working together on semiconductors, which shows that there is commitment and they're working together now. But more importantly, the EU also has leverage over China, which is why China won't be able to succeed in their goals. They need things like silver from the EU, which is why empirically they won't get the economic gains. But finally and most importantly, if you create an independent agreement between just the US and EU, you're going to see backlash from China. They say that the problem is existing right now, but making the problem worse is most definitely not a way to solve it. At the end of the day, protect the economy, you're not benefiting geopolitics. So vote nay.
Can we really quickly see the semiconductor evidence?
Yeah, sure.
I can just look at it, it's probably quicker than putting it in the
Sure.
document.
Yeah.
Wi-Fi loads. I think I have it. Hold up.
Let me know.
Yeah, I can scroll down.
Which piece of it?
It's all of these. So I can just keep looking. You keep scrolling.
That's 10 seconds. So we have 250 remaining, we will begin using this. Oh, you have 10 seconds, so we have 240 remaining. So we'll begin now. It's 2:30, so we have 10 seconds left.
And it's just going to start on our side of the case on the affirmative, and then move over to theirs on the negative. And if everyone's ready, I'll start my time. While this round has gotten fairly complicated, the easiest place to vote is our argument about reaffirming commitment. We tell you that due to specific tariffs on industries like steel, the EU is not have positive relations with the US. However, the AF gets rid of these steel tariffs, recommits the US to the EU, and shows them that we have their back against China. That's really important because right now, China is already moving closer to the EU, and because the US does not have their back, the EU is also moving closer to China. The AF reverses this trend, allows the US to show the EU that we have their back, lets us stand up to the spread of authoritarianism, and prevents these atrocities that China is committing right now, and prevents the spread of authoritarianism into Europe. Now let's go to their responses. The first thing they say is that because we're entering a trade war with China, that shows we have cooperation. But remember, they don't respond to the fact that trade is not equivalent to cooperation. We trade with China, we definitely don't cooperate with them. Additionally, remember what our evidence from case finds, which is not responded to the entire round, which is that investment from the Chinese government is increasing, whereas investment from the US is decreasing. That's really important because it shows that China is ever growing in their presence in the EU, and only through this affirmative ballot can we stop this increased trend. Finally, they say that we can see that we're already working together through things like semiconductors, but the problem is their evidence does not say we're working together even once. It says we're both investing in semiconductors, but it is not working together, and that's the important thing. Finally, they say that we shouldn't make the problem with China worse through a trade deal. But the problem is already bad enough right now. China is sending surveillance equipment to places like Hungary so Hungary can survey its own citizens. That proves that Europe is becoming more and more authoritarian, and because they're moving closer to China, they aren't going to stand up to the future threats against the world that China commits. That's why you're voting affirmative, to prevent the spread of authoritarianism. At that point, though, we can go to their side of the case. Let's start on their first argument. The most important thing you have to recognize when filling out your ballot is that they do not explain how domestic industry is harmed. We both agree that tariffs are already extremely low right now. What that means is that businesses from the EU could already go into the US if they wanted to because of how low tariffs there are. Additionally, they say that it could just be lobbying, EU lobbying, but they don't respond to the fact that the US has just as much, if not more lobbying, and the US would never allow Buy America provisions to be taken out through this deal. The US has the same amount of lobbying as Europe. Finally, they say that the benefits of trade deal are exaggerated. Maybe their one think tank says that, but the consensus of economists agree that free trade is a job creator. Lastly, most importantly, on their finance argument, they don't respond to the fact that under the last TTIP provisions, the past US-EU trade deal, we were not able to harmonize financial regulations, and threw that idea out 2 years into the 7-year talks. It was impossible then, it's impossible now, and thus you're affirming.
Alright. You guys good for granite cross?
Yep.
Yes.
Want to do this sitting down?
We can see.
I think
Alright.
we're good.
And then can we get first question?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about the semiconductor evidence.
Yes.
The evidence we read from the White House that is titled US-EU Joint Statement of the Trade and Technology says, quote, "We have been cooperating fruitfully under 2 administrative arrangements, a joint mechanism aimed at identifying supply chain disruptions." Goes on to talk about making semiconductors. How does this not show that the 2 regions are cooperating on semiconductors?
This goes back to the problem that I talked about in my rebuttal, which is that both sides can claim and say they are engaging in cooperation, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're taking actions in reality.
Wait,
For example, our Walla evidence and Etchickson evidence from our case tells you that they're saying that they're doing a lot of cooperation, but that's not actually happening in reality. For example, all the investment is independent, not actually coordinated.
Let's talk about taking action. I feel like you guys are the ones that aren't showing any actions, right? You keep fear-mongering and say, oh, China's going to do this, China's going to do that. But what are we seeing? We're seeing high trade, we're seeing semiconductor cooperation, we're seeing agreements between the two. Like, all we're seeing is high stuff right now, and you're just fear-mongering and say it's not happening.
Once again, you've just repeated that through every single speech, and there's a couple
Because
of issues.
it's true.
Hold on, I'd like to respond. First, you have not responded to the fact that the US and EU are both independently investing in semiconductors. They're not coordinating that investment. And additionally, you have also not responded to the fact that US investment into Europe is decreasing, whereas Chinese investment into Europe is increasing.
Our White House evidence, which you conceded out of rebuttal, says that from the White House says that we have been cooperating fruitfully under 2 administrative arrangements, specifically with the European Union. You guys came and read this and did not respond.
Like,
to
I
it.
would say that even if they're doing independent investment, it doesn't matter. If the 2 regions are literally cooperating and working together to do things like increase semiconductor supply, it probably means their political goals are aligned, especially when there's a government
There's
article.
a big problem with that is that your evidence from the White House, we used to read that in our case. I know what that says. It says that yes, we may be talking about semiconductors, but we're not doing action. The investment that the US and EU are taking are not together. They are completely separate because tariffs mean they're not working together.
It says
Okay,
we
that's
have
fine.
been cooperating, and I assume
Yes.
that's past tense.
We've spent 2 minutes. You guys can take questions.
Yes, okay. Let's talk about your argument about domestic barriers.
Yeah.
So if most tariffs in the majority of industries are already around 2%, What is actually stopping foreign companies from displacing domestics?
Wait,
Specific Buy American policies that you've asked in every cross and that we have answered are what's going to go.
Also, more importantly, I think you're missing the analysis that we are making. If you do things like pass a trade agreement where multinational corporations now have the opportunity to lobby the government and grow their own corporations, obviously they'll have incentives to do so, which is why our evidence finds that thousands and hundreds of thousands of jobs will be lost.
There's two key issues with that. First, the Buy American provisions were not in your case. You did not explain to the judges what your argument was until you were asked to.
Right.
But secondly, what Williams says in summary, which is fundamentally not properly addressed, is that both sides have an incentive to lobby. Domestic firms in the US want to keep Buy America. Europe wants to get rid of it. There's incentives on both sides, so it's likely not going to be removed.
We'll respond to
Yeah.
each, because that's
Yes.
the problem.
Alright, we have a minute and 49 seconds left, so we'll start it now.
For the last time, I'm Naranjan Ashok, second speaker for the con. And the order of my speech is going to go our case, their case. Everyone's ready? All right. My time begins now. When you affirm, all you do is give big multinational corporations the ability to come into the US, destroy our banking regulations, destroy our domestic economy, and harm our small businesses. My opponents only give you a couple responses to this argument. The first thing that they tell you is that American companies can always lobby. But insofar as we're not talking about the big American companies, we're telling you the small US businesses are the ones that are going to get displaced. The big American companies really don't have an incentive. The EU companies are the ones that have empirically, during the TTIP, when the EU-US signed a trade agreement, saw Buy American provisions go away, lobbied for all of these regulations, and we saw millions of jobs lost. But once again, don't just take my word for it, look at history, because empirically, we have seen 3 million jobs go away when the US signs free trade agreements in the past. If empirically you are seeing all of the impacts that we talk about, we're going to see that if we sign another trade agreement with the European Union. Now, the only other thing that my opponents tell you on our argument about financial regulations is that we're going to harmonize regulations, and it's empirically never happened. Not only was this response 15 seconds over time, but my partner already responded to this. Our argument is not about harmonizing regulations, it's about losing regulations as a whole. For example, when big multinational companies are going to come into the domestic industries, we're going to be forced to deregulate our financial services. The problem with that is that these are the same financial services that stopped us from an 2008 recession, and they're going to put us in the place of another recession if this continues to happen. Once again, don't just trust us, trust the empirics. It's in the TTIP, and historically it was there. If you want to save millions of people and help the US economy, you're always going to vote for us. But let's go to their case. The round is over when they concede that the EU also has leverage on China in places like silver. China can never cut off imports and exports and abuse their influence because the European Union always has leverage. This was extended through our last 3 speeches, and they never respond to it once. Additionally, the fact that trade is high now, semiconductor cooperation is high now, the NATO exists, and there's so many other reaffirmance and agreements that happen now, there's no problems with the status quo. It only happens when you affirm. Don't let the multinationals win one more time, and vote con.
We have 10 seconds left. And now. order of the speech is going to be our arguments, their arguments. Anyone not ready? Okay. In my opponent's last speech, they try to tell you that nothing is wrong with the current state of politics between the US, EU, and China. Here is what you know and what isn't responded to at any point. The US's investment into Europe is decreasing. China's investment into Europe is increasing. China is actively expanding things like surveillance technologies into Europe in countries like Poland, Germany, and Hungary to increasingly expand its authoritarian influence. The reason for this is that the US has refused to remove high tariffs in sectors like steel that have indicated to Europe that we see them as a threat rather than an ally, which is destroying fruitful cooperation between both sides. When China is able to expand its influence into the continent, they can control European countries. They take less of a hard stance on China. It allows them to spread authoritarian influence in Europe, but also in other areas around the world. And those kind of regimes have discriminated against their people. They have historically led to millions of deaths. They make two responses at the end of this round. The first is that the EU also has leverage on China. But sure, even if the EU has some leverage over China, overall they are still moving closer and closer to China by the day, something my opponents do not respond to. Investment from China is pouring into the EU and they have no way of stopping it. The affirmative can. Secondly, they say there are tons of forums for cooperation between the US and the EU, but have still not responded to the idea that this is all talk and no action. For example, they are investing separately into semiconductors. They are not taking any sort of joint action together. They can say they are cooperating, but there is still deep distrust that can only be solved through a trade agreement. On their arguments, the fundamental issue, which is entirely unresponded to from William's summary, is that while sure, European countries might want to roll back Buy America or financial regulations, there are just as powerful lobbying efforts on the American side that don't want those things to happen, which is why it's unrealistic to assume that they would. For example, in the original agreement, they threw out the idea of addressing regulations like financial regulations a few years into the negotiations. Finally, they say that 3 million jobs will be lost, but don't respond to the fact that because most tariffs between the US and EU are already very low, we cannot compare it to these historical examples where tariffs were very high. For all these reasons, we are proud to affirm.
Good on, guys.
Good.